And so again, social media was this missing puzzle piece, basically, that connected people not just to the human rights activist community, and not just to answer the call of many who then started posting on Facebook, the We're All Khaled Said page, for example, that we now know one of the co-administrators of was Wael Ghanem, the former Google executive. But that page, when it sent out the call to come out and protest against the beating to death of Khaled Said, was connecting all of those strands again. Those who had been in a hardcore human rights activist community, all the way to those who had been very apolitical and who had not even taken part in street protests in 2005. Because Egypt in 2005 saw this flourishing of street activism that hadn't existed so openly for a while. We saw, now this is another strand coming in now, we've seen huge demonstrations in Egypt basically in line with international events. So in 2000, you saw huge demonstrations inside and around Tahrir Square to support the Second Palestinian Intifada. In 2003, you saw another huge demonstration in Tahrir Square against the US invasion of Iraq. But what was beginning to happen at the end of 2004, beginning of 2005, was these largely apolitical people, not associated with any major political party in Egypt, which were all considered dead in the water anyway, but coming together to form a loose coalition under groups like Kifaya, which means enough, or the National Association for Change, or unaffiliated with either, but basically to march through the streets in Egypt to call for the end of the Hosni Mubarak regime and to protest against rumors that Mubarak wanted to hand over power to his son, Gamal Mubarak. So this was one of the newer, more recent instances where people were actively going against the regime. Not US foreign policy, not the Israel-Palestine conflict, but internal Egyptian politics. And again, many of those people on the street found each other through social media, because many of them were involved in either the blogging community, which in Egypt probably began end of 2003, 2004. Many were involved with open source Linux, who themselves saw what they were doing as an act of dissent, allowing people to access the internet and access things online for free, using things like Linux. That in and of itself was for them an act of dissent and defiance. So those people would often find themselves online and then come out onto the street. But what they were doing in 2005 by moving from their blogs and on the street was basically recreating a template for what began to happen after Khaled Said died. Because revolutions are not created just online. Many people joke about how people received invitations to the Egyptian revolution, i.e. January the 25th, through Facebook events and through Twitter. But revolutions are feet on the ground. Revolutions are courageous people who go out and stand up against riot police and stand up against the regime. Revolutions are not people at home who click like and click attend. You actually have to make that real by going out onto the street. And that's what you saw happening, this move from the virtual between the real and the virtual seamlessly. You saw that happening in 2005. Now, in 2005, I moved back to Cairo because of one of those blogs written by one of those young activists who was moving back and forth between the real world and the virtual world. And I moved back because for me as an Egyptian, it was the first time in my life where I felt that there's something important and something passionate was happening against the Mubarak regime. And I moved back for 4 months to take part to join the street protests, but also to report on, we had 2 elections that year, presidential and parliamentary. The largest demonstration that I marched in 2005 was 3,000 people in Tahrir Square. So that's 3,000 in Tahrir Square in 2005. Fast forward to 2011, when you had up to 2 million people in Tahrir Square. So what happened in an intervening 6 years? What happened is basically a process of all those comings together that I've been drawing for you, between all these different groups that in their own way, often small, often invisibly, often very quietly, standing up against the Mubarak regime and often not finding each other because demonstrations were illegal, because gatherings of more than 5 people were illegal. And so they would find each other wherever space came up. And more recently, that space was coming up, the platform to find each other was coming up through social media. So it's important to see social media not just as the place where young people would go online and say, I count, but where all these other actors who were moving against the Mubarak regime found a place to say that we all count against the Mubarak regime. And to take that outside of Egypt and to see how it worked under other regimes, when you look at a place like Tunisia, that was under a much stricter kind of cyber control than Egypt was. I mean, Hosni Mubarak, of course, famously shut down the internet a few days into the uprising, but Tunisia had always suffered from controls from the Ben Ali regime. But there as well, you had activists who recognized that despite these controls, they could move freely on certain sites and get their message out, not just internally to Tunisia, to fellow Tunisians who couldn't find them because of state-controlled media, but to the outside world. And so when that young man, Mohamed Bouazizi, set himself on fire on December 17th of last year, a collective like Nawat, which sent out photographs and which collected information about what was happening, became one of our major sources of information, because television channels like Al Jazeera could not operate inside Tunisia. And so many of the TV footage that you saw came either from Tunisian bloggers on the ground who would upload their videos and pictures onto the internet, or through a collective like Nawat, which basically became a clearinghouse for videos, for images, for information in Arabic, English, and French to the outside world, and became our bridge, basically, that we could then walk across to find out what was happening in Tunisia. In countries like Saudi Arabia, where firewalls are used for other reasons, not just political, but for political reasons, and also to filter any quote-unquote sexual or indecent content, but that often encompassed many more things than just those indecent things, because indecency is a great cover for all kinds of censorship. The eye that was happening there, and the collective eye that was finding each other there, was, for me, the most interesting of those eyes was Saudi women. Some people have famously called what Saudi women have done online electronic unveiling. But what Saudi women were doing online and using social media for was leveling a playing field that in the public always worked against them because of very strict gender segregation, and because Saudi women could not access the halls of power, or in many instances access places where they could influence public opinion in the way that they wanted to, and so they would go online and do that. And it's been happening for many years, where you have Saudi women activists, Saudi women bloggers, chat rooms where women would go and they would argue with men and they would discuss things with men, and in those chat rooms it didn't matter that you were a man or a woman. Now, you've heard of various abuses of gender over the past few days, Gay God in Damascus, others. I don't want to talk about Gay God in Damascus because it takes too much oxygen out of this very important discussion of what's been going on by real activists and by very courageous people who have stood up to regimes and did not have to invent this persona, because we don't have to invent the courageous lesbian woman who we now know doesn't exist, because there were very courageous lesbian, bisexual, transgendered women in countries like Saudi Arabia, in countries like Lebanon. In Lebanon, for example, they belong to a collective called Meme, which is it's from the Arabic letter Meme, which comes from the Arabic word mithleya, which means same sex, which is the first word, and we only really came up with this word in Arabic a few years ago. It was the first time that you could refer to same-sex relationships in a non-pejorative way, because in the past, the Arabic word for same-sex would usually mean pervert or depraved or something like that, but the word mithli or mithleya means same-sex and is neutral. And so Meme is an online collective that enables lesbian and bisexual women in Lebanon and transgendered to find each other online and then move from that online platform to meet each other in the real world. So we don't have to invent lesbians who are courageously working against social constraints or political constraints, because they exist. And one of their biggest tools and weapons that has enabled them to say I count have been social media. So Meme, for example, publishes a regular online magazine called Birsus, that is now a platform for people of various sexual orientations and backgrounds to express themselves. They published a book of oral narratives of bisexual and lesbian women in Lebanon and transgendered from across the country, from across religious backgrounds, from across class and sectarian backgrounds, to basically bust this myth that same-sex relationships are an invention of the West and that they don't exist in our culture in the Middle East and North Africa. So that was happening in Lebanon. To go back to Saudi Arabia, where you saw women and men using social media against the regime, one famous instance came when they staged a hunger strike on Facebook to protest the detention of political dissidents. Another instance came when Jeddah suffered severe floods 2 or 3 years ago, and the government failed miserably, and several people in Jeddah, Jeddah should not have to suffer deaths because of floods, because surely the municipal government there could have sent people to rescue those stuck in the floods. But activists in Saudi Arabia were able to use Facebook and other social media to basically shame the government for the deaths that resulted from the floods. And as a result, the king called for a committee to investigate, and some people were fired. So through social media, Saudi activists were able to hold their government accountable. So again, an instance of saying, I count, and using the various people who go online to say, I count, and then finding each other, and through the collective of I counts, this network that is then created and meets each other on social media, they stand up to the regime and they hold the regime accountable. In Syria, you've had blocks on Facebook, and you've had blocks on other social media platforms and outlets, but even there people have been able to use proxies to get around that. So I would go to Damascus and I wouldn't know about the proxies, but half my Syrian friends would know that you could get around them and use social media there once you know how to get across jump over whatever firewall they put up. Now social media in Syria, the majority of Syrians, we don't have high figures for internet uses in Syria as we do in Egypt. Country by country, it varies greatly, obviously. But the importance of social media there now is clear, because the Assad regime bars international media from going on the ground and covering its atrocities during the uprising. We are dependent now on footage that Syrian revolutionaries upload again. Now, of course, a very unfortunate and very depressing consequence of this ridiculous Gay Girl in Damascus blog is that mainstream media is wondering now if any of this is true and if any of this is accurate. But my contention is that this is mainstream media's fault to begin with, because Gay Girl in Damascus, for me, I found it on The Guardian, and The Guardian should have known better as a mainstream media outlet in checking its sources and making sure that this Gay Girl in Damascus actually existed. So now you have a whole bunch of mainstream media with egg on their faces, now questioning social media when they should be questioning their own ways of checking out what happened. Clearly the people who set up the blog, who I unfortunately know, and I didn't know that they were behind this blog until 2 days ago, the fault obviously lies at their feet, and the time wasted, especially with the kidnapping issue. But I hold The Guardian just as accountable because they should have checked their facts. And now I hope that mainstream media doesn't start blaming social media, which have become very important tools, as I mentioned, very important tools of non-violent resistance to regimes, to get messages out, to get images out. Because how would we have known about a 13-year-old boy called Hamza al-Khatib, who some of you might have heard of, who was abducted by Syrian regime forces after he started demonstrating. His cousin died in one of the demonstrations, so he joined the revolution. He was abducted by Syrian forces, he disappeared for a month, and his mutilated body, with the penis cut off, was dumped at his family's home. And we know that this really happened because someone filmed the poor little boy's mutilated body, and you can hear the voiceover describing in details the horrendous wounds and torture that he suffered before he died. So there are very real people, very, very courageously in the real world, standing up to very real, vicious regimes. So let's not use, a 40-year-old, a middle-aged American man's attempt to pretend to be a lesbian for whatever reason, to detract from that courage and to detract from the importance of social media connecting all these activists who for a very long time had very really courageously risen up against various regimes. And it continues today in Egypt, to bring it back to Egypt, because on January the 25th was essentially a day to rise up against the Egyptian police. It was not intended as rise up against Hosni Mubarak and topple him. It was supposed to be against the police because it was police day. And it was supposed to use the anger that remains against the beating to death of Khalid Said last year. But it was clearly also innovated and inspired and energized by what happened in Tunisia. Because just 11 days before January the 25th, Tunisians toppled Ben Ali, ended his 23-year rule in 29 days.